April 11, 1944, 26,000 feet above Hanover, Germany. The cold was absolute, -40 degrees, wind slicing through the aluminum skin of the bombers like invisible knives. The air vibrated with the roar of hundreds of Wright Cyclone engines, each one pushing its limit as the 8th Air Force's formation crept deeper into the heart of Nazi Germany. Inside one of the B-17's, waist gunner Sergeant Leo Haskins could see the white contrails of bombers stretching to the horizon, a steel skyway leading straight to Berlin. But what made him feel truly uneasy wasn't ahead of him, it was behind. Because for the first time in months there were no little silver shapes diving in to protect them. No P-47 Thunderbolts, no P-38 Lightnings. Those fighters had already turned back out of fuel, out of range. The gunners knew what came next, the German fighters did too. In a dim, smoke-filled ready room hundreds of miles below, Luftwaffe pilots from Jagdschwader 26 were already laughing. To them, the Americans were predictable, brave, yes, but foolish. Every time the bomber streams came, they knew when the escorts had to turn for home. The moment those P-47s banked west, Germany's skis belonged once again to the Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts. Oberleutnant Hans Eckhart zipped his leather flight jacket and smirked as his mechanic pointed to a small photograph, a sleek new American plane, one that looked almost too fragile to be real. "Das ist das new Mustang," the mechanic said. "The Allies claim it can reach Berlin." Eckhart laughed. "With that, look at its size, it's barely larger than our trainer planes. The fuel tank alone must be a joke." By noon, the first black dots appeared over the horizon. The B-17s were right on schedule, and just as expected, they were alone. "Jets!" someone shouted over the radio. The FW-190s dove from the sun, cannons flashing, tearing into the bomber formation like wolves hitting a herd. Within seconds, the sky was filled with smoke trails and parachutes. Sergeant Haskins gripped his .50 cal, firing at streaking shadows. Another bomber beside him took a hit, its right wing folding like paper. "Christ," he muttered, "where are our fighters?" Then something strange. From the northeast, a shimmer, tiny, fast, silver streak slicing through the cloud layer. For a heartbeat, both sides froze. The Germans thought they were another wave of bombers. But as they closed in, their shape was unmistakable. Long nose, bubble canopy, and under the wings, two strange, dull-looking fuel tanks. The P-51 Mustangs had arrived. They dove through the formation like hawks, the sound of their Merlin engines sharp and angry, ripping the thin air apart. The German pilots, mid-attack, suddenly found themselves outturned, outclimbed, and outgunned. Eckhart pulled back on his stick, eyes wide as tracers tore past his canopy. "Impossible," he shouted to himself. "They can't be this far from England." Down below, Haskins caught sight of one Mustang rolling past, its nose marked with the red and yellow checkers of the 357th Fighter Group. "Sweet mother," he said, watching it tear apart a 190 in seconds. "They made it all the way here." The laughter in German ready rooms turned into silence that day. What they didn't yet know was that the secret to the Mustang's reach, those small, ugly drop tanks they'd mocked, had just rewritten the rules of the air war over Europe. February 1943, Inglewood, California. Inside a dimly lit workshop at North American Aviation, a group of engineers huddled over blueprints smudged with coffee stains and fingerprints. The air smelled of oil, hot metal, and cigarette smoke, the aroma of invention. On the drafting table sat the problem that had haunted every Allied air commander since the bombing campaign began: range. No matter how powerful, how heavily armed, or how brave the pilots, Allied bombers couldn't reach the heart of Germany without losing hundreds of men. Fighter escorts simply couldn't go the distance. The P-47 Thunderbolt was a beast of an aircraft, tough, fast, but it drank fuel like a locomotive. The P-38 Lightning could fly farther, but it struggled in the cold altitudes of northern Europe. Every mission ended the same way: escorts turning home over the Rhine and bombers flying alone into the jaws of the Luftwaffe. That's where the Mustang entered the story, an aircraft born from British desperation and American ingenuity. In 1940, before the United States had even entered the war, the British Purchasing Commission approached North American Aviation with a request: build a new fighter fast. They wanted something better than the P-40, and they wanted it yesterday. In just 117 days, North American's team rolled out a prototype called the NA-73X. It was sleek, efficient, and unlike anything else in the sky. But early versions, powered by American Allison engines, were good only at low altitude, useless for escorting high-flying bombers. Then came a transatlantic stroke of genius. Across the ocean, engineers in Britain's Royal Aircraft Establishment decided to test-fit the American Mustang with their own Rolls-Royce Merlin 61 engine, the same heart that powered the legendary Spitfire. The result stunned everyone. The new P-51B screamed through the clouds faster, higher, and farther than anyone believed possible. It was the perfect fighter, almost. The one remaining flaw was fuel capacity. At the Inglewood plant, engineers like Edgar Schmude and Lee Atwood stared at the problem for weeks. Every inch of the fuselage was already filled with fuel. There was no space left, no extra room. What they needed was external range, something that could be attached, used, and discarded mid-flight. A young engineer proposed a wild idea: disposable drop tanks made of pressed paper. At first, even the seasoned designers laughed. Paper? In combat, how could a material that soaked up rain like a sponge carry high-octane aviation fuel across the Atlantic? But with aluminum reserved for bombers, steel too heavy, and plastic in short supply, paper was all they had. So they tried it. Layers of laminated paper sealed with resin and coated with varnish were molded into aerodynamic tanks capable of holding 75 gallons of fuel each. They were light, cheap, and if a bullet hit them, they didn't explode like metal tanks. The idea sounded absurd, but tests proved it worked. By the autumn of 1943, these odd paper tanks began appearing beneath the wings of P-51s in England. Pilots were skeptical. Some joked that one rainstorm would send them crashing into the channel, but once they saw the gauges, they stopped laughing. With those tanks, a Mustang could fly from bases in East Anglia all the way to Berlin and back. In December 1943, the first extended-range missions began. At 20,000 feet, the Mustangs cruised beside B-17s for hours, sipping from their paper tanks until the fuel was gone. Then, with a flick of a switch, the tanks dropped away and the fighters were free to engage. German intelligence noticed. Reports came in describing small new fighters appearing deeper and deeper into German airspace. Luftwaffe analysts dismissed it at first, believing no Allied fighter could possibly sustain that range. They assumed these reports were mistakes. They weren't. By early 1944, the Luftwaffe began losing entire squadrons trying to intercept bombers now protected all the way to their targets. Those same tiny drop tanks, once mocked as cheap and foolish, had given the Allies what they'd always lacked: an unbroken shield of escort fighters from England to Berlin. And for the German pilots who laughed at them, the realization came not in laboratories or reports, but in the skies when that unassuming Mustang appeared beside the bomber streams, ready to fight where no Allied fighter had ever reached before. March 4, 1944, over Berlin. The air trembled with the thunder of engines. More than 600 bombers, B-17s and B-24s, pushed eastward through a sky smeared with black flak bursts. It was the first time American bombers had dared to strike the capital of the Reich in daylight. The mission was code-named Operation Argument, but the airmen called it something else: the Big Week. For years, Berlin had seemed untouchable, protected not just by distance but by the brutal efficiency of the Luftwaffe. Every previous raid had been a bloodletting, hundreds of planes lost to Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs before they ever reached their targets. But this time, something was different. The German radar stations picked up the incoming formation, and within minutes, squadrons of interceptors roared into the sky from bases outside Magdeburg, Jüterbog, and Brunswick. Their pilots were veterans, men who had spent years hunting bombers over Europe. They knew the pattern by heart: the escorts would turn back over the Ruhr and the helpless bombers would be theirs. Only this time the escorts didn't turn back. From the bright haze over the horizon came the unmistakable glint of silver wings, low-slung, graceful, deadly, P-51 Mustangs, hundreds of them. Major James H. Howard led one of the squadrons from the 354th Fighter Group. His voice crackled through the radio, calm and measured. "Keep tight, protect the heavies, pick your targets clean." Below them, the black crosses of German fighters cut upward through the cloud banks. The sky erupted in chaos. Contrails twisted and merged as hundreds of aircraft dove, climbed, and spiraled in deadly ballet. The Merlin engines of the Mustangs screamed as they met the enemy head-on. Howard's squadron slashed through a formation of FW-190s, his 6.50 caliber guns lighting up the sky. One burst of fire ripped through a German's wing, sending it spiraling into smoke. Another 190 tried to break away, but the Mustang was faster, climbing higher, rolling tighter, turning sharper. From his cockpit, Howard saw something extraordinary. The bombers, those lumbering fortresses that once flew to their deaths, were still in formation, unbroken. For the first time in memory, they weren't alone. Below them, German radio chatter turned frantic. Was ist das? Sie sind überall. What is this? They're everywhere. The Luftwaffe's finest aces, men like Walter Dahl and Adolf Galland, soon realized the truth. These weren't short-range intruders, they were permanent residents of the sky. The Mustangs had range, speed, and altitude on their side, and worst of all, they had numbers. In 1 week, during Big Week, the Luftwaffe lost nearly 600 aircraft and hundreds of irreplaceable pilots. The Allied losses were heavy, but for the first time, sustainable. The balance of air power had shifted. On the ground, even German civilians could sense the change. Where once their skis were guarded by the proud roar of Messerschmitt engines, now the constant sound of sirens and distant explosions marked the coming of daylight raids. In Berlin, a Luftwaffe staff officer stared at a reconnaissance photo showing Mustang Escort lines reaching deep into German airspace. "It's not possible," he muttered, tracing the range arcs with his pen. "They can't reach that far, they shouldn't reach that far." But they did, thanks to those odd little fuel tanks, made of laminated paper, hanging like afterthoughts beneath each wing. The pilots who once mocked them now flew for their lives against an enemy who no longer had to turn back. That spring, the German Air Force began bleeding out in the skis over its own homeland. The Mustangs owned the day. And for the bombers that once flew terrified and alone, every silver silhouette that appeared beside them felt like salvation. The sky was burning again. The 1st Air Division had launched over 700 bombers toward the industrial heart of Germany, targeting aircraft plants, oil refineries, and transportation lines that fed the Reich's war machine. Every man in those cockpits knew the risk. Leipzig wasn't just another city, it was a fortress ringed by some of the most experienced fighter groups left in the Luftwaffe. For months, German command had promised that the Mustang threat was exaggerated, propaganda, nothing more. But as the morning light spread across the airfields outside Leipzig, pilots of Jagdgeschwader 11, JG-300, and JG-1 climbed into their fighters knowing something had changed. The radio chatter was subdued. There was no laughter now, no mocking jokes about paper tanks, just silence and the dull mechanical growl of engines warming to life. At 10:00 a.m., the first radar contacts appeared, dozens of dots on the screens moving steadily east to west. The bombers. Orders went out, intercept immediately. But this time, the German controllers hesitated. Reports from earlier missions had been grim, entire squadrons of FW-190s shredded by Mustangs before they could even reach the bombers. Still, they launched. They had to. High above, in the thin, freezing air, Captain Don Gentile of the 4th Fighter Group adjusted his oxygen mask and checked his fuel gauges. The twin paper tanks beneath his Mustang had been drained hours ago and jettisoned into the clouds below. Now, the plane felt lighter, faster, predatory. Beside him, Captain John Godfrey flashed a thumbs-up through the canopy. Ahead, the bomber stream stretched across the horizon, hundreds of glittering fortresses moving like a slow, steady tide. And above them, like a curtain of silver guardians, the Mustangs spread out in layered formation, waiting. The first German wave came in from the southeast, 60 FW-190s diving through the sunlight. The sky exploded. .50 caliber tracers cut bright orange lines through the cold blue air, intersecting the black smoke of burning aircraft. Gentile rolled inverted and dropped behind a 190, his guns rattling a staccato rhythm that vibrated through the cockpit. The German fighter burst into flame, tumbling end over end into the clouds below. "Scratch one," Gentile shouted into the radio. But for every Mustang strike, there were more targets ahead. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had into the fight: veteran aces, green recruits, even training units pressed into combat. They came from every direction, desperate to break through the wall of escorts. They didn't. Every attempt was met with precision and fury. The Mustangs fought in pairs, using altitude and speed to dominate the engagement. The Merlin engine's high-altitude power allowed them to climb out of danger and dive again at will, a luxury the German fighters had lost long ago. By midday, the air over Leipzig was filled with falling debris, shredded wings, burning fuel trails, and black parachutes drifting silently toward the ground. Down in the Luftwaffe command bunker near Brunswick, the situation reports were unreadable chaos. Squadrons that had launched with 30 aircraft now had 5. Some didn't respond at all. An officer placed a trembling hand on his map, tracing the front lines, and whispered to no one in particular, "We're Haben Kane Luftwaffe Mayor. We have no Luftwaffe left." It was true. In just weeks, the once invincible German Air Force had been broken in the very skis it had once ruled. The Mustangs had done more than escort bombers. They had destroyed the defenders, systematically and relentlessly, until Germany's airfields became graveyards of twisted steel. For the bomber crews, the change was almost surreal. Missions that had once felt suicidal now returned with most aircraft intact. In debriefing tents across England, pilots whispered about it like a miracle. "We made it back," one said, still shaking from adrenaline. "The fighters never left us, not once." And all of it, the shattered Luftwaffe, the burning skis, the turning of the air war, traced back to those strange, fragile drop tanks that German pilots had once mocked. Little tanks made of paper and glue had carried a new kind of war across the sky. The city below was a sprawl of gray and smoke, its rooftops shimmering under the glare of 1,000 explosions. The once proud capital of the Third Reich, seat of Hitler's power, now trembled under the steady thunder of Allied bombers. What had begun as an impossible dream just months before was now routine. American bombers, flying unbroken from the English coast to the heart of Germany, shielded by a wall of silver-winged Mustangs. Major John C. Mayer of the 352nd Fighter Group banked his P-51 Petty Second into a gentle roll above the formation. Below him, the bombers droned onward, their wings flashing in the light of distant fires. Mayer's voice crackled through the radio. "Keep your eyes open, boys, the vultures might still be hiding in the clouds." But the sky was eerily quiet. The great swarms of Luftwaffe fighters that had once filled this airspace were gone, destroyed, scattered, or grounded by lack of fuel. Those that dared to rise did so in small numbers, desperate and disorganized. They were met instantly by the Mustangs. At 25,000 feet, Captain William Wisner spotted movement, a pair of Bf-109s trying to sneak up on the rear bombers. He broke formation, dove hard, and closed the distance in seconds. The Germans never saw him coming. A burst from his 6.50 calibers turned the first into a rolling fireball. The second tried to climb but stalled, its engine choking on thin air. Wisner climbed after it, firing again until the Messerschmitt disintegrated into shards of aluminum. "Two down," he radioed calmly, circling back to the formation. For the men inside the bombers, the difference was life itself. No longer did they count the seconds until the escorts turned home. No longer did the cry of bandits, 3 o'clock high, signal certain death. They looked out their small, frost-lined windows and saw the Mustangs, sleek, steady, circling protectively like hawks guarding their brood. Staff Sergeant Leo Haskins, now a veteran waist gunner, pressed his gloved hand to the cold glass and watched one of the Mustangs roll lazily beside his B-17. The pilot looked over, gave a small salute, and then banked away. Haskins smiled despite the fear still twisting in his gut. "They're with us all the way," he whispered. "All the damn way." Below them, Berlin erupted again. The bomb loads struck factories, rail yards, and the labyrinth of roads that kept the German war machine alive. Every impact sent shockwaves through the smoke-filled air. Civilians huddled in bunkers as the city trembled. Inside one of those bunkers, Luftwaffe General Adolf Galland stood before a wall map covered in red pins, each marking a destroyed airfield or lost fighter wing. His officers reported losses that could no longer be hidden. Pilots were gone, fuel reserves nearly exhausted, and now the bombers came every day escorted from takeoff to target. Galland turned to his aide and spoke with quiet resignation. "The day belongs to the Mustangs." Back in the air, the Allied formation turned west for the long flight home. The bombers' engines rumbled like a living thing, steady and defiant. The Mustangs formed up around them, their shadows flickering over the clouds as the sun began to sink toward the horizon. Each of those sleek fighters carried the same secret, a legacy of simple ingenuity. The paper drop tanks, once laughed at in Luftwaffe ready rooms, had shattered the logic of air warfare. With them, a fragile idea became unstoppable reality. The United States had built a fighter that could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, and by doing so had stripped Germany of its last great advantage. As the Armada crossed back over the channel, the radio crackled with a final transmission from one of the bomber crews. "Tell command we made it, Berlin hit, escorts with us the whole way." The war in the air was decided. From that day forward, no city, no airfield, no target within Germany was beyond reach. The Mustang's long shadow fell across the Reich, and with it came the slow, certain death of Nazi air power. The laughter that once filled German flight hangars was gone, replaced by silence, by disbelief, and by the sound of Allied engines echoing endlessly overhead. In the end, the tiny paper fuel tanks, dismissed, ridiculed, and doubted, had done what fleets of bombers, generals, and engineers had failed to do. They made the impossible possible. And in that fragile paper, soaked in fuel and courage, the war began to turn. The war was over. The engines were silent. The great armadas that once thundered across the channel now sat quietly on empty runways, their metal skins dulled by months of rain and exhaustion. Between them stood rows of P-51 Mustangs, their noses painted with names and symbols: Old Crow, Petty Second, Glamorous Glen III. Each one carried scars, chipped paint, patched bullet holes. Soot stains from exhaust. They looked tired but victorious. In the mess hall, the men who had flown them sat around tables littered with coffee cups and folded maps. They spoke in low tones, not about victory parades or medals, but about the friends who hadn't come back. For them, the Mustang wasn't a symbol of glory. It was a memory machine of missions at dawn, of frozen hands on throttles, of the deep hum of the Merlin engine beneath their boots. Captain Don Gentile stared out across the airfield from the open hangar door. The rain fell in thin silver lines, and somewhere beyond the fog, a single Mustang idled, its propeller slowly ticking over. "You know," he said quietly to his mechanic, "I used to think this thing was too pretty for war. Guess I was wrong." The mechanic smiled faintly. "Pretty can be deadly, sir." Gentile nodded. "Yeah, deadly enough to win a sky." Across Germany, the remnants of the Luftwaffe told the other side of the story. Burned-out hangars, shattered airstrips, and wrecked fighters littered the countryside. The men who had once mocked the tiny Mustang with paper wings now spoke of it with something close to awe and fear. To them, it had come from nowhere, an apparition that haunted their every mission. In one captured Luftwaffe diary found near Magdeburg, a pilot wrote, "The new American fighter is always there. High, fast, waiting. We climb to meet the bombers and it falls upon us. It's tanks. I laughed at them once. I don't laugh anymore." Historians would later call the P-51 Mustang the plane that won the war. That phrase oversimplified things. Wars are never won by one machine alone, but there was truth behind it. It was the first aircraft that could escort Allied bombers from England to Berlin and back again, changing the air campaign from attrition to dominance. With air superiority secured, the Allies could bomb Germany's factories, oil plants, and rail networks at will. Every shell, every tank, every bullet the enemy lost was a direct consequence of that control. But the Mustang's story was more than just its victories. It was a testament to what happens when creativity meets desperation, when engineers refuse to accept the word impossible. From the British who swapped its engine, to the Americans who built fuel tanks out of laminated paper, to the pilots who trusted those strange contraptions over enemy skis, the Mustang was born from defiance. By late 1945, thousands of them were being flown home or scrapped. Their purpose was complete. Yet in the decades that followed, the P-51 refused to fade away. It served in Korea, raced at Reno, and hung proudly in museums around the world. Its shape, that long nose, that bubble canopy, became an icon of victory. Today, when one flies at an airshow, the sound still carries a kind of memory. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine doesn't roar, it sings. That deep, rolling note that once echoed over the fields of Germany still turns heads and stirs something in the chest. It's the sound of persistence, of courage, of 1,000 stories compressed into a single tone. And perhaps somewhere in the crowd, an old man might look up, eyes misting over as he remembers a cold morning over Berlin, the sun glinting on aluminum wings, the smell of oil and gunpowder, the sight of a silver Guardian sliding into formation beside his bomber. The Mustang's gift was not just its range or its power, it was hope. Hope that someone would be there when the sky turned black with flak and fire, hope that ingenuity could triumph over arrogance, hope that, even in the darkest hours of war, a fragile idea made of paper and willpower could change the fate of millions. When those little tanks first left the runway in England, German pilots laughed. When the Mustangs came roaring back from Berlin, nobody was laughing anymore. The laughter had turned to disbelief. The disbelief to fear. and fear finally to silence. In that silence, the legend of the P-51 Mustang was born. A legend carried on wings of steel, paper, and unbreakable resolve. The air was cold enough to sting the skin through flight gloves. Frost clung to the Mustang's canopy edges as Captain John C. Mayer's P-51D Petty Second cut through the morning haze. Below him, a column of black smoke marked where another German train had met its end. Over the radio, voices crackled, calm, professional, and weary. Bandits, 11 o'clock, high five, maybe 6 of them. Mayer squinted through his gun sight, eyes narrowing as silver sunlight glinted off the wings of FW-190's braking formation. "Let's clean this up, boys," he said, voice low and certain. The Mustangs banked in unison, engines howling as they dove from altitude. The Germans scattered instantly, no longer the hunters but the hunted. One by one, they fell. The air was alive with tracers, flashes, and vapor trails twisting like threads of smoke across the endless blue. A B-17 formation lumbered ahead, massive, vulnerable, but safe under the silver Escort. The radio erupted again, bogies cleared, all bombers accounted for, heading home. Mayer exhaled slowly. The horizon stretched flat and empty, the sky calm once more. It was becoming a familiar pattern, the Luftwaffe appearing in small, desperate numbers trying to challenge the inevitable. The Mustangs had changed everything. At air bases across England, young pilots trained for shorter and shorter missions. The threat that had once haunted bomber crews, the fear of being abandoned near the target, was gone. The P-51's long-range tanks had erased that terror. The skies over Germany now belonged to the Allies. Every day, the sound of hundreds of Merlin engines filled the morning air. Rows of mechanics worked by lantern light, patching bullet holes, refueling, and rearming for the next mission. Men slept in tents with their helmets still on, dreams filled with the drone of flight. The Mustang wasn't just an aircraft anymore, it was a rhythm, the pulse of an air war finally tipping in the Allies' favor. In Berlin, German radar operators tracked the incoming formations. Once they would have called for intercepts, squadrons of FW-190s or Me-109s scrambled to climb and meet the bombers head-on. But now their screens told a different story. The formations were escorted from coast to target, always covered, always protected. One officer, exhausted and bitter, whispered to another, "It's hopeless, they never come alone anymore." By March, the Luftwaffe's elite fighter groups were nearly gone. The men who had survived years of air combat were either dead, captured, or grounded for lack of fuel. Those who still flew did so knowing they were flying into a slaughter. They would take off, see the glint of Mustang wings above them, and understand it was already over. The Mustang pilots didn't celebrate those kills. They knew what it meant to face a doomed enemy. For them, each mission was a mixture of pride and grim duty. They weren't chasing glory, they were finishing the job. When they landed, the ground crews would swarm the returning aircraft, checking the bullet holes, topping off the oil, replacing spent .50 caliber belts. The pilots would walk away silently, their faces streaked with sweat and soot. Some would write quick notes in their logbooks, a few words to remember the day. 3 FW-190s destroyed, no losses. Escort successful. But the real victory was measured not in kills, but in survival. Every bomber that reached home meant 10 men alive. Every target hit meant one step closer to ending the war. The little paper tanks that had once been mocked had made that possible. High Command understood it well. Eisenhower himself later remarked that without the Mustang, the invasion of Europe might never have been possible. The bombers could now strike deep into the Reich without being shredded. The factories that built tanks, the refineries that fueled them, the rail lines that fed the front, all were burning, systematically dismantled under the protection of the P-51. At Bodny, Leston, and Debden airfields, pilots joked about the irony. The very tanks they once distrusted had made them legends. They'd tap the side of those wing-mounted pods during pre-flight, calling them the lifelines. The sound was hollow, light, almost fragile, but inside was the promise of return. And as the winter gave way to spring and the last desperate days of the Luftwaffe crumbled, the Mustang continued to climb, patrol, and protect, each mission another nail in the coffin of the air war over Europe. Even as cities fell and the German lines collapsed, the silver wings still roared above, guardians of a sky that no longer belonged to the Reich. April 16, 1945, 22,000 feet above Dresden, Germany. The morning sun shimmered off ice-crusted clouds and the city below lay eerily quiet, its streets empty except for the occasional convoy of retreating troops. From this altitude, Dresden looked peaceful, a city of spires and tiled roofs, but the air carried tension.